If you're visiting with us today, Greg and Kashka are out of town. Greg starts a meeting today down in Dothan, and so in his absence, I drew the short straw and you drew the shorter straw. I'm going to talk today on something that we rarely preach about. Let you think about that for a minute and see if that whets your appetite any. But before I get into that, I don't have any good Florida Gators jokes, and it wouldn't be good to tell them today with Greg not here, so that kind of defeats the purpose of that. And I don't have anything that I can think of disparaging to say about Florida now. Give me a week and I probably will. But we will miss him, and we always miss them when they're gone. We miss his good preaching, and we are so grateful for them. And then, Gary, I'm going to send you a book of great old Mississippi sayings, since you weren't familiar with some of the best of them. But as for this morning, there's a yogiism, Yogi Berra, who once was observing about life on the West Coast, and he said, it gets late early out there. And so you may feel that way here in just a few minutes, that it got late early this morning. So what am I going to talk about that we rarely talk about? Well, most of you know, and I'll just use this as a segue into the lesson, that Richard recently presented an annual report on the congregation here and our activities for the year, our plans for the year, the things that we have in mind, a focal point of some of our lessons. In the process, we presented a review of the finances of the congregation, what we spend on various activities of this church that we engage in, the vast bulk of that. If you were paying attention to that, and I know finances aren't the favorite subject for most people, but the bulk of our spending is on preaching and teaching the gospel, both here locally and literally around the world. And then, of course, we have expenditures for the maintenance of our facilities here, the maintenance of the building. And we had, this just kind of kicked off this thought that maybe that was something you'd been thinking about. We had a sizable expenditure to replace some of the aging aspects of the building. And so the bank balance came down quite a bit. And so at this point, you're thinking, okay, the elders are going to talk to us about, we got to do something to build that money back up. No, that's not what I'm going to talk about. We actually knew that was coming. We planned for it. We had the resources for it, thanks to you. And so I'm not going to really talk to you this morning about meeting a budget. We're going to talk about giving. In a lot of congregations across this city, when the preacher gets up and talks about giving, or one of the elders gets up and talks about giving, they're trying to motivate people to meet a budget. Look, this is what we want to spend in the coming months or the coming year, and you got to step up and you got to put the money out there so that we can do what we want to do with our budget. The primary point I want to make this morning as we think about giving is that New Testament giving is not budget driven, it is heart driven. And so I really want you to bear in mind that that is going to be the fundamental thesis for what we will have to say today. So we're not making a pitch about we need more money. We're not also making apologies for talking about this subject. I'm not going to give you 20 disclaimers about, I don't mean you to feel this way, or I don't mean you feel that way, or I don't want you to reach this wrong conclusion or that wrong conclusion. The scriptures are very direct in their instruction to individual Christians about their giving, about what it means, and about what motivates it. And we want to spend just a few minutes today talking about that. So we, your elders, don't set a conceptual budget and then rail on you. You got to make pledges, you got to tithe, all that sort of thing. We want our hearts to be in the right place when we consider this activity that is a responsibility, as the Bible makes clear, for a Christian. So a couple of things that we're going to look at today. Giving, as we said, can be a serious subject, but it is a biblical subject, and so I want to look at several passages as we go through here. I'm not a big PowerPoint guy. I'm not a PowerPoint guy because I don't know how to do PowerPoint. I love the way a lot of you guys, the way you teachers use that skill, and to me, as an audience member, it is valuable because it helps us, I think, focus on what the teacher wants us to focus on. But bear with me because I'm not going to give you PowerPoint slides because I couldn't make them work the way they're supposed to work. But focus on this concept. What is God trying to tell me as a Christian that I need to be thinking about and activating on as I'm considering giving? The second thing I want to address sort of tangentially here is to talk a little bit about the process of how that happens and understand the role that God has given us to realize how that works and why that can be important to us too. So I'm going to cover some ground that on the surface will not be new or revolutionary to any of you. Every passage we're going to read, you've read them before, you've probably considered them before, but we want to talk about them this morning, and we really wanted to use the presentation of the budget kind of as a springboard to do that. And we wanted to do that as your elders and not necessarily task the preacher with doing that. So 2 levels of giving, personal giving, that the New Testament clearly teaches on. We're going to look at each of these this morning because they both have responsibilities that are going to bear on us, and they're serious responsibilities. They're not presented in the New Testament as optional. And that's not a subject because of that. That ought to be sensitive to us. What does God say? The New Testament describes, as most of you know, how members of a local church have this responsibility in giving to meet the scriptural activities of the local church. We presented that budget, and we presented it by line so that if you were curious enough to look at it, you could see that the things that we're devoted to expending resources on are things that the Bible tells us New Testament churches expended resources on. We're trying to do what biblical churches did with regard to the resources that the members chose to give. So anything that we do as a budget, you enable us to do it. And that's what I want you to understand. The activities that we're involved in are because of the generosity of your heart. Believe you me, if our giving doubled next week, we as the elders would have no problem finding worthy causes, scriptural causes, biblical causes to expend those resources on. Do not fear that we will overgive and not have anything to do with our money. We're very, very careful and thoughtful about how we do that. So first of all, among local churches in the New Testament, local churches took responsibility for the needs of their own members, fellow Christians. And there are clear examples of those needs existing in the local church in the first century. In Acts chapter 4, in the early church, beginning in verse 34, the scripture says, "Nor was there any among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of land or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of these things sold and laid them at the apostles' feet. And they distributed to each as anyone had a need. And Joseph, whose surname was Barnabas, a Levite of the country of Cyprus," he wasn't even a Jerusalem resident. He was a visitor like a lot of other people were, "having land, sold it and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet." And so the New Testament church, the very first church, is using the resources contributed by the members to meet the needs that exist within that congregation. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, in verse 9, we see another example of this, although it's presented kind of from a reverse point of view, where Paul writes to Timothy, "Do not let a widow under 60 years of age be put on the list." And then he goes on to list qualifications that these widows would have to be put on the list. Well, what is the list? Well, if you read further, the list is those members of that group, in particular who were widows who met these qualifications, the congregation could provide for their needs. Remember, we didn't have Social Security back then. We didn't have safety nets back then. Widows were in a particularly vulnerable situation, not just financially, but in many other ways. And God makes a provision through the resources of the local church for these people to be cared for. So there are 2 examples there of New Testament churches caring for the members among themselves. But New Testament churches also, when they became aware of the circumstances of needy Christians in other places, also could commit resources for those. And we have Paul's instructions to the church at Corinth, which we will look at here shortly, instructing them to be prepared to send relief to the Christians in Judea. Not Christians in Corinth, not Greeks, not Gentiles, but Jews down in Judea, because there was a famine in Judea, and the Christians in Judea were in need. And so Paul says, you lay by in store, and we'll take some of those proceeds and we'll supply the needs of Christians somewhere else. So you see in these examples that our giving as a local church supplies not only the needs of the ones we have among us, but also in cases where we see needs elsewhere. And by the way, I will say this about this group. In times past, we have presented cases to you of needs that we were aware of, significant needs in other parts of the world, sometimes on the other side of the world. And God bless you, you responded to those needs generously. And we, the elders, are very happy that we have a group that has that kind of heart. And we'll have those needs in the future. It's not the last time you'll have a chance to do that. But that's a part of the uses that New Testament Church has made of the giving that members did. Also, by God's design, the preaching of the gospel, both in their own communities and in other places, were efforts that were supplied by the giving of the members of a local church. 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul writes, "Let the elders," verse 17, "who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain." And so the scriptures authorize the congregation to support men who preach and teach full time, as our evangelist Greg does. In Philippians chapter 4, in verse 16, Paul writes to the church at Philippi, commending them because he said, "When I was in Thessalonica, you sent once and again to my needs." And so local churches not only can support the preaching of the gospel in their own location, but they can support the preaching of the gospel in other places as those opportunities arise. And if you looked at our budget, you saw that we have quite a commitment to preaching the gospel in other parts of the world. And we make every effort, and we've got men among us today who make excellent efforts to stay in touch with those men, to understand what their situations are like and what their needs are. Because we want to be more to them than just somebody who signs a paycheck. I can tell you that Roberto and Rosanna think Caleb is one of their best friends because he's constantly in communication with Roberto. He keeps up with his needs, and I can't begin to tell you how much that means to men like that when we take an interest in them, not just financially, but in other ways where we show our interest in them. And I would encourage you, if you have an opportunity, 5 or 10 minutes on your hand, we can give you the email addresses of these guys. You can send them an email. Been thinking about you, been praying for you. Let us know, let me know if you have any needs that I can help to meet. So the preaching of the gospel locally and in other parts of the world is a part of the responsibility that we have as Christians, as members of this local church. And the giving pattern is not hard to see either. If you turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, you can see what Paul's instruction there is as he's preparing to come to Corinth. And he has in mind a plan to take some of the resources that the members there at the church in Corinth would contribute and take that back to Judea to help with relief for the famine. But notice what he says in chapter 16 and verse 1. "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches in Galatia," stop right there, "is this only an instruction for Corinth?" No, this is an instruction for all the churches that Paul writes to. And he would say later on in this letter, "As I've taught you, so I teach the same thing in every church." So this is not simply instruction to Corinth. This is instruction to any New Testament church that Paul was associated with. "As I gave orders to the churches in Galatia, so also you must do. On the first day of every week, let each one of you lay by something in store as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." So the process of how we do our giving is laid out in this verse. On the first day of the week, on a regular basis, we lay by and store. The specifics of that process are not necessarily mentioned in this passage, and there's a reason for that. When Paul says in the Great Commission, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel," there are two commands in that instruction. The first command is to go. The second command is to preach the gospel. One of those commands is specific and one is more general. The terms of what they were supposed to preach is specific. What was it? Preach the gospel. Don't preach political views. Don't preach military strategies. Don't preach societal issues. Preach the gospel. That's specific. The go part is a general command, and that's by the wisdom of God as he foresees that as times change and as technology changes and as circumstances changes, the most effective way to go may also change. In the first century, their options were go on foot, go by ox cart, go by ship, go by horse. It wasn't always going to be that way. Today, we can go into other parts of the world even by electronic means. But God wasn't specific about that so that we could find more effective ways as times change. So it is with this concept of giving. He doesn't give a specific that says, pass a gold medal tray row by row. That's how I want you to do it. He doesn't give a specific that says, as Jesus would observe later and as we will look at shortly, a big box in the temple where people walked by in the sight of others and tossed their money in. There are many ways to lay by and store that would fit the general command to do this. We can do that electronically now, exchange values by electronic. We're still laying by and store when we do that. So the concept of laying by and store is given as a general concept of, and how we expedite that is up to us to determine the most effective way to do that. But the key instruction here is on a regular basis, you give as you've been prospered. That is our responsibility as members of a local church. That's not by any means all that God says about being givers. There's a lot of admonition not only to the how, but to the why, the state of mind that we have as givers. In fact, there are several encouragements and instructions about what should be in our hearts as givers. And all of these are not oriented, again, toward meeting a budget, but are oriented toward not only the receivers of the resources, but the givers of the resources are benefited, spiritually uplifted, encouraged by this action that we can take. Back in our passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, where we saw Paul instructing them, he says in verse 2, to give as we have been prospered. I hope that's not fuzzy to you. I hope that's not an unconquerable concept to give as we've been prospered. Our giving, particularly in regard to liberality, is not based on the budget. It's based on how God has blessed us. And this is just common sense to me. We have resources that God has blessed us with, but we are only the stewards of those resources. If you will, they're on loan to us from God. And He expects and anticipates a return from us for that responsibility. The parable of the talents is confusing in that we generally think about that parable as being related to having money and making more money. But the talents were given in accordance with the ability of the receiver to generate fruits on those talents. And so the judgments made by the master in that parable were not because one guy made more talents than another guy did. It was because they accepted the responsibility that was given to them. And the foolish servant who didn't do anything with his talent said, Lord, I was just intimidated by the idea that you expected a return on this. And I think we give him way too much credit to think that he really meant was I really didn't want to disappoint you, so I buried it in the ground. I think what he's saying is I didn't want the responsibility. And the master said, you had it anyway. I don't accept that excuse. God blesses us with physical blessings. The only reasonable thing to do is to return those with fruits to Him so that His cause can be advanced. It would seem superfluous for me to remind us of the prosperity that we enjoy in this country. This is the most prosperous nation. I can say this without reservation. I can say it without hedging. This is the most prosperous nation in the history of the world. People who lived in times before us didn't have, for the most part, the homes we have, the fine homes we have, the comfortable homes we have. Most people didn't have those. Most people didn't have a nice automobile to drive around in. People that lived in the first century didn't have the equivalent of $100 in a bank account. They didn't have it. They weren't sure where their food would come from in a month, let alone a year or 5 years. People lived much more Gary, this is an expression I know you know, hand to mouth in that time. They weren't able to make long-term plans because the nature of the socioeconomic culture they lived in did not allow that to be something they could rely on. They were not prosperous people relative to us. In fact, they would look at us and say today, I cannot imagine in my wildest dreams the prosperity that you have. And I'll tell you this, that's still true of about 95% of the world out there. If you get a chance to travel very much, particularly to travel to areas of the world that would be considered poorer nations, it's appalling at the poverty you see. If you haven't ever seen something like that, it's hard for me to describe it to you, of what abject poverty a lot of people live in. And they look at us and they go, I can't even fathom what it's like when you want something to be able to go buy it. Not a concept that people had, particularly in the history of the world. So we need to recognize that. We need to be responsible. Listen, we are 5-talent people in terms of what God has blessed us with. We're not even 2-talent people. We're certainly not 1-talent people. I'm talking about resources. We're the 5-talent man. That's a concept that ought to be allowed to sink in, and for us to realize responsibility lies in the blessings that God has given us. Christians in Philippi were poor, even by the standards of the world of that day. But I want you to notice what Paul says to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Beginning in verse 1, he's writing to the church at Corinth, and he's talking about the Philippians and other churches in Macedonia. And he says, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed upon the churches in Macedonia. That's primarily Philippi, also Thessalonica. That in great trial of affliction, listen to these words, in great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. Poor people, really poor people, even by the standards of that day, Christians gave with liberality. For I bear witness that according to their ability and even beyond, they were freely willing, look at this, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. The Christians in Philippi begged Paul for the opportunity to give liberally, even beyond their means. Let that sink in. I wish I could say that that was my heart in giving, because the Christians in Philippi knew that the Christians in Judea would benefit, but the Christians in Philippi also knew that they would benefit from this giving. Paul would go on to say in chapter 9, but this I say, that he who sows sparingly, this is what the Philippian Christians understood, he who sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Let each one give as he has purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or necessity, but God loves a cheerful giver. There are 3 or 4 more ideas brought out in these verses about the nature of our giving. He says, give as you've purposed in your heart. Give cheerfully. Don't give grudgingly. God loves a cheerful giver. And he goes on to say, he will make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. What is God promising them? That they're not going to become poverty-stricken because they're liberal in their giving. I had a series of lessons I did a few years ago here and some other places where we talked about, the title of the series was Being Good Stewards. And so we talked a lot about how we think about our possessions, how we, in principle, think about our money, what's a wise way to deal with our money. And in the course of teaching those lessons, I asked the group, we gave them a pencil and some paper, and I asked the group, I want you to write down your budget. Just go line item, write down your budget, the budget that you try to keep your household on. Everybody do that. Gave them a few minutes. went back through and said, share your budget with me. And almost everybody, probably 98% of them, the number one item on their budget was their mortgage or their rent. Seems logical, right? Got to have a roof over your head. Next was food. Got to eat. Clothing. We went down the list. Car payment. Insurance. And on we went. We got down to football tickets. We got down to entertainment. What was missing? I'm telling you, I think we had 40 people. 3 people out of 40 had giving to the cause of the Lord at the top of their budget. Give with purpose, Paul says. What does that mean? Clearly, one thing it means is prioritize. And there were a lot of red faces in that audience, and I wasn't doing that to try to embarrass them, because I've made budgets like that myself. But the notion the New Testament presents is that giving is thought about ahead of time. It is planned. It is not simply responsive. It is anticipatory. We think ahead of time about what our obligations are, about what it looks like to be generous in our giving, about what it looks like to be cheerful in our giving, about how that is built into how we regard our resources. And so giving is purposeful. It is what you've purposed or determined ahead of time in your heart. And I would say this, that's not just applicable to giving as a member of this congregation. That is applicable as well to what you may do or have opportunities to do personally with regard to other people that are needy, maybe not Christians. I think almost all of the time, our generosity in that realm is generated only when something is presented to us. We see a need, and hopefully in the compassion of our hearts, we want to help meet that need. But more times than not, when that happens to us, we go, oh, I don't have the resources to do this. I didn't see this coming. I didn't plan for this. Even that giving can be purposeful. You can budget giving to needy situations even before you see them. But this idea of being purposeful in our giving is underestimated by us, and it is what helps us create the priority that Jesus was calling for us to see when he says in Matthew chapter 6, seek first the kingdom and its righteousness, and all these other things that you've been worried about, God will supply them. God doesn't condone that we impoverish ourselves by our generosity. In fact, if I read these passages correctly, he pretty much won't let that happen. A person that has shown him that he has a heart for compassion and giving, this passage says God will supply the seed for that sowing. The last prophet in the Old Testament, Malachi, and I hope the kids in our 7th and 8th grade class, Clint, know where Malachi is now. We've been drilling these kids on where their books of the Bible are. You guys know where Malachi is, right? Very last prophet at the end of the Old Testament. The Christians, or not the Christians, the Jews who had come back from Babylonian captivity, now were living in the Jerusalem area. God had restored them. They had rebuilt the temple. They had rebuilt the walls of the city, but something wasn't working right. Life wasn't good for them. They weren't having the bountiful harvest that they had hoped they would have. They weren't having the good life that they'd hoped they would have. Something was wrong, and they were trying to figure out what it was. And what happens here in this situation is that people came to be contemptuous of God because God, in their mind, wasn't making their life work the way it was supposed to. And so God commissions the prophet Malachi to talk to them. And this is what he says in chapter 3, Malachi 3 and verse 8. It's a shocking statement he makes to them. Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, how have we robbed you? Hey, what are you talking about, God? I haven't gone to the temple and stolen anything. Will a man rob God? In tithes and offerings, you are cursed with a curse. For you have robbed me, even this whole nation. And now, here comes the challenge that he presents through Malachi. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. I want to tell you this, that I've got this imaginary sermon, or it may be a Bible class I'm going to do someday. And the title of it is Promises We Don't Believe. Oh, we always believe every promise God makes, right? Do you? Look at what God says to them. Try me in this, he says, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will be not enough room to receive it. God says to those people through Malachi, if you will fulfill your responsibility, the responsibility, by the way, you agreed to as people living under the law, if you will fulfill your responsibility to me, I will open the windows of heaven to you. I will bless you so much that you won't have a place to put it all. Do you think that was only a promise to the Jews in 430 BC? Or is that a promise we don't believe today? That God will bless us. This is not a motivation to get rich. This is not, there are people that teach the gospel of prosperity, and the basis of that gospel of prosperity is if you'll give to God, he'll make you rich. That's not the motivation here. That's not the promise here. What God is saying is, if you fulfill your responsibility to me, I can more than recompense you for that commitment. And I will give you so much to keep giving like this that you'll struggle to find a place to put it. I struggle to believe that promise, but I ought to. That's a promise God has made. Maybe we don't believe it. But the challenge was given to them by Malachi to do that. Well, I want to look at one other thing here about this idea of giving liberally. In Mark chapter 12, this is one of my more interesting passages to me to think about. Luke also has an account of this situation, but in Mark chapter 12 and verse 41, we have Jesus and his disciples, and they're in Jerusalem, so very likely close to the time of the Passover. And they go into the temple and they're observing as the people walk through the temple and make their giving, cast their contributions into the treasury. And if you do a little research, there actually was a big container that was over here at the side of the temple. It would have been on the outside of the temple, not the inside of the temple. And the people would walk by and in view of other people, put their offering into this treasury. So you could see what other people were doing. Well, what do you think some people were doing? Showing off. But look at what's said here in Mark chapter 12. And I like this because Mark's gospel is a gospel of discipling, and that's one of our focuses of the year. Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how people put money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites. You could probably equivalize that today to 2 pennies. Very, very modest amount, needless to say. So he calls the disciples to himself and said to them, assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all the others who gave to the treasury. For they all put in from their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. So the concept of giving purposefully, cheerfully, abundantly, generously turns into something that is sacrificial. I want you to add all those ideas up and see if you don't come up with sacrificial. We have a hard time understanding what sacrificial means, I think. In the culture we live in the prosperity that we have, sacrifice is not something we have deep familiarity with. Go back to that example I gave of people creating their budget. What a lot of those folks were doing without realizing it was they were doing residual giving. That's what these folks, Jesus and his disciples, were doing. They were giving out of their excess, he said. They were giving stuff they weren't going to miss. Sacrificial giving involves giving that we feel. And I don't mean emotionally feel. I mean feel from the point of view of it affects the decisions we're able to make in our lives. Sacrificial giving might involve me crossing that bucket list item off. I'd love to go there, but I think there's a better use for my resources in preaching the gospel, in meeting the needs of others. Sacrificial giving might be you buy a used car instead of a new car. Sacrificial giving might be I don't take advantage of all of the media options I have in my Verizon account. Sacrificial giving is giving of the heart. It is not budget driven. It is heart driven. So I wanted to offer those thoughts to you today, just because we talked about giving and we talked about our budget, but we thought it was important to make this point to you that as we consider as individuals what our responsibilities are in giving, they are not driven by the amount of money the Kahabites elders want to raise so that we can find a place to spend it. As I told you before, I assure you that whatever you determine to give, we will find beneficial scriptural uses for. But that's your choice. So let's think about these things today. It's interesting to me that when Jesus observed the people putting money into the treasury, he already knew what their circumstances were. He didn't have to have a sheet to tell him, this is how much this guy's worth, this is the percentage he's giving, it's sacrificial or it's not. Jesus already knew what was in their heart, as he does with us. Let's be aware of our responsibility. Let's be aware of the good things that can be done, but let's also be aware of the blessing it is to us when we do what God's asked us to do in this arena. Maybe I need to make some changes in my life in regard to this. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians in chapter 11 about the misuse of the Lord's Supper, he said, one of the things I want you to do as you contemplate the Lord's Supper is examine yourselves. Think about why you're doing it. Gary, the eulogy today was great on this subject. Think about why we're doing this, what it means, what the deeper implications of it are. That's what examine yourself means. We examine ourselves in this practice too. These ideas that we've discussed today, are they a part of your heart when you consider how much God has blessed you? I hope these things will help us. Maybe there's somebody in your audience today that hasn't named the name of Jesus yet. We want to give you an opportunity to do that this morning. Become a part of this spiritual family. This is a great blessing that God has given us to have loving people who are part of our group here, who care for one another, who do things for one another, who want to be a family. But that's all grounded in our faith in Jesus Christ. We're a family because we share a common belief of Jesus as the Son of God and as our Savior. And if that's something that you've been thinking about and you want to respond by expressing your faith and being baptized into